Welcome to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Kentucky attorney Jeff Roberts has over 25 years of experience. He'll provide answers to your questions related to personal injury and automobile accidents, workers' compensation claims, and Social Security disability benefits. Let's join Jeff for this episode. Friends, welcome back. We have Jeff Roberts in the studio from Murray, Calloway County. Also has a satellite office over there in Hopkinsville now in Christian County. So, Jeff, today let's jump into the topic of chemical-related injuries. You know, there are a lot of chemical plants around. There are a lot of plants that actually just use chemicals, and these can happen in a lot of different ways. So, we'll go ahead and hit a number of different topics related to this because, quite honestly, these are horrible injuries when they happen.
Exactly. They can be very, very bad injuries. And during my career, I've represented several people who have been injured by chemicals in the workplace or otherwise from that standpoint. And, you know, it's with chemical injuries, you can be injured in multiple ways. A lot of times, you know, when you people think about a workplace injury, they think, you know, they lift something or something of that nature and have a
strain a back or a neck
back injury or knee injury or something of that nature. But a lot of factories, whether they are in the business of producing chemicals for other uses or if they're just making other parts, they use some sort of chemical a lot of times as a lubricant or as a cleaning agent or something of that nature that employees are exposed to, and then the workers can have different types of injuries. You know, with a lifting injury, it's usually a joint or a bone type injury. But with chemical exposures, you can have, if the chemical gets on the skin, then you can have chemical burns that will affect a person and can be very serious in the injuries that are caused by those chemical burns and the treatment of those. But then people are also exposed to inhaling the fumes of the chemicals, which then can cause internal damage for the individual. So you've got different avenues that a person could get injured in either a job setting or even other settings from exposure to some dangerous and hazardous chemicals.
Right, and a lot of times you may see this referred to as a toxic exposure type injury. We just kind of call it chemical injury, but that's another common term you'll see out there. You know, a lot of times if there would be a leak in a plant or somehow where there's a massive exposure there, you mentioned the inhalation and how you can get lung scarring. You can actually pass out. You can actually die from certain chemicals if you are inhaling those. And the problem is, it's not just the people right around that area. That tends to create a cloud, which could drift and travel throughout the facility or even externally. And that's another part of this conversation is where we want to kind of talk about here a little bit about the people in the neighborhood surrounding that area or other businesses around where there might be a potential chemical leak or even an explosion.
Correct. Yeah, you can have, if there is a leak of the chemical, that can cause problems to people who live in the neighborhood who may work at a different factory, but in close proximity to that factory where the leak occurred. And then with a chemical leak of some sort, if it gets to the ground, because you know some can be airborne, some can be liquid form and then seep into the ground and can get into drinking water and then cause problems years down the road. Right now, as we're recording this, people are probably hearing about the lawsuits over the Camp Lejeune chemical exposures in the drinking water that was contaminated back years ago, and now they know about it and they realize that all of these injuries, cancers and other problems that are being caused by that exposure. And you see that in other places, other locations as well from that. And so, you know, it's not just the workers that may be exposed and be injured because of chemicals at a plant. It can very well be the neighborhood around that, or it can extend for an extended period of time if it gets in the water table.
Absolutely, because again, that'll travel and that can affect all sorts of different things.
Yes.
Let's come back to the plant, and we'll talk about, for instance, there's a I'm working around a dangerous caustic chemical, and it splashes on my skin. I mean, ideally, I should have been trained on where the aid stations are. A lot of times, you'll see like an eye wash station and things like that. The plant is responsible to have those in the area. If there's a failure in that equipment, how does that affect the claim?
Well, from a work injury standpoint, if the employer violates a safety statute or safety regulation, OSHA regulation, or if they have their own internal policies and procedures that they have in place for safety and they don't follow that, those policies or procedures, then that can increase what they have to pay out in workers' compensation benefits to the injured worker. And that comes in, basically it's called a safety penalty among attorneys anyway when we talk about it, but it increases the amount of income benefits that the injured worker can receive because of their injury or their exposure to that chemical from that standpoint. So they're hit with an increase in what they have to pay out to the injured worker in workers' compensation benefits. There's also could very well be an OSHA fine for that type of violation. And then those type of violations as well, if it's not an employee that's injured, but it gets outside the plant, or a vendor that's in there in the facility working that's not an employee of the plant, they're an employee of somebody else, and there's a violation. That's where the negligence comes in for the potential civil lawsuit, personal injury lawsuit against that plant over that type of injury. Now, the employee is limited to workers' compensation benefits in Kentucky. It's nearly impossible to get outside of around the workers' comp exclusive remedy provision. But if it's someone else that's in that plant, legitimately has a reason to be in that plant, and they get exposed because of negligence, then they've got a civil lawsuit against the plant.
That makes sense. I remember back in the day, I used to travel to a lot of manufacturing facilities, and I happened to do some work inside some plating facilities, and I was always amazed at the chemicals that would bubble up and splash out of the tub. They'd be on the ground, and I'd be not just worried about my shoes or my boots at that point, but worried about, oh my gosh, is this dangerous? But I mean, it just seemed to be that was just kind of part of it. It'd be like going through a packing facility or something like that.
Yeah,
it's just the environment we work in. But I was never comfortable in those facilities.
And there are certain safety precautions that can and should be made to in those settings from that standpoint. And I've been involved in cases, unfortunately, where there are the mistakes that are made. Where somebody's in there doing work on a line that is supposed to be cleared. It's cleared by the other shift, and it's supposed to be drained and nothing in it. And then when the worker opens up the valve or takes off the valve, there's still pressure, there's still chemical in that line that is sprayed out on them. In those individuals, sadly, you can have the skin contact, which causes chemical burns, and then unfortunately, some ingested that can cause some serious injuries as well from getting the chemical in their mouth.
Not only burns that are chemical related, but also just toxic exposure to the vital organs. I mean, you could see that over time as well, I would think.
And then in the situation that you were talking about in the plating industry, what you saw there anyway, I've seen it in others where, especially with somebody who has on a protective boot, and then the chemicals, if they get down in that, the time it takes the person to get everything off, to get down, to get that shoe off and get the sock off, and it can be, the chemicals have been contacted the skin very long period of time. relatively speaking, it can cause some very serious injuries to a person's foot or something of that nature.
Well, when we go back and we talk about, for instance, a back sprain or you hurt your shoulder or something like that, and you have to go through a period of treatment, and then you go through a period of rehab and hopefully maybe even a couple of surgeries, and eventually you reach that point that we've talked about a lot in these podcasts of maximum medical improvement, MMI. If you've been exposed to a chemical, it seems like it's almost difficult or more difficult to prove that, okay, now I'm developing a cancer 10 years down the road. I mean, can you come back and reopen that claim, or how do you handle that as an attorney when you know somebody's been significantly exposed? There's just no signs of that type of injury.
Reopening the claim can be difficult at times, but a lot of times with that type of situation, the medical is going to be covered because you've got the medical treatment for an extended period of time from there. And there's potential chance when you have new injuries to be able to pursue something from that standpoint. What I also see is basically the chemical exposure over a long period of time causes problems. There's not a skin burn from it or anything. Heavy metal exposure, for instance, can cause some serious health consequences if you're exposed over a long period of time. Beryllium exposure, anything, things of that nature. Where, unfortunately, I've represented people who've had lung cancer and that ultimately was fatal because of their exposure over long periods of time in the work setting. And proving those cases can be difficult because a lot of times they're exposed to different things over the period of years that they've worked at the facility. And then one of the biggest challenges is proving, was this cancer caused by their exposure to something at work? Now, if it's asbestos, for instance, there's certain asbestos diseases that are the only cause we know of is asbestos,
like a mesothelioma or
mesothelioma,
asbestosis.
and so those are kind of easy because they were exposed to asbestos at work. They have this disease that comes from asbestos exposure. There's no indication of exposure anywhere else. It's
pretty much a straight line at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And even if there is some asbestos exposure, as long as the workplace exposure is approximate cause, it doesn't have to be the only cause. If it's approximate cause or one of the causes of it, then there is potential for the workers' compensation claim in that setting. And one thing that we haven't really talked much about at this point is also can be in these situations where there's a potential against the manufacturer of the chemical.
Really?
Yes, there's those potential claims there, like the asbestos, for instance. The people who my understanding, this occurred long before I was practicing law, but my understanding is that some of the ones who were producing and putting asbestos out there knew about the problems long before the public knew about it, and they weren't telling people. And that type of conduct can lead to liability and lawsuits to where that company has to compensate the individuals that are injured because they didn't tell them about the dangers of this product.
And that's real similar to some of these big cases you see people advertising for on TV. Hey, if you've been hurt by Roundup or exposed to Roundup, as a now you've got some kind of cancer or something like that. That's what you're talking about.
That's exactly what
they're
I'm
saying.
talking
Hey, the manufacturer knew about this, but either didn't disclose it,
didn't warn about it, didn't tell people we know about this problem. From that standpoint, so those are those type of situations where if you're working in a plant using this we'll just use a lubricant, for instance, because I know when I worked at Berry Stratton, there was a lot of the machining work. There was lubricant that was used there. So let's say a lubricant that is, if you're exposed to it for a period of time, can cause people to have kidney cancer.
Sure.
I'm just using an example here, but and the manufacturer realizes that because they've been told by several people, okay, these people are developing kidney cancer, and then they wait and they keep producing, keep sending it out. Then those in the manufacturer should have to pay for the injuries caused by their neglecting, not telling people, and not giving the warnings.
And is that handled as part of the workers' compensation claim, or is that a separate action altogether?
That would be a separate action against the manufacturer of the product. That you would have, since it occurred at work, you would have the potential workers' compensation claim. You would have the potential claim against the manufacturer as well. And then you get into some legal wrangling where the workers' comp insurance company very well may be entitled to be reimbursed from the manufacturer for what they've paid out in medical bills and things of that nature as well. So it can be the injured worker have the claim and the workers' comp insurance company have the claim, and then or one or both pursue it, and if the injured worker does, then they may have to pay back workers' comp.
Okay. So again, you would bring those actions. You would bring both of those claims simultaneously. You wouldn't have to wait for one to be completed. You wouldn't have to go all the way through the workers' compensation process before you begin pursuing the claim against the manufacturer.
Correct.
Those are, okay.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And in fact, you may file the claim against the manufacturer first, just because the statute of limitations on that type of claim is generally shorter than the one for workers' comp. Normally, on a workers' comp claim, you have 2 or 3 years, depending on whether it's an injury or an occupational disease. We're talking about disease here, so you'd have 3 years from the date you found out that you had an occupational disease, and you got 1 year on the claim against the manufacturer from the time you found out. So
from the time you actually found out, not necessarily the exposure, but the time you found. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's come back to on the chemical burn side. Let's come back to the inhaled situation. So there's chemicals in the air, and you inhale them. We're talking about employees. We're not talking about people outside the buildings, outside the company. Typically, you're going to see, again, it could kill somebody if it's a toxic enough cloud that they could, unfortunately, die at that point of exposure.
Correct.
A lot of times you'll see respiratory damage, so you'll see scarring within the lungs, you'll see all other types of issues. And again, from a workers' compensation standpoint, do they have to go through the standard, okay, this is your impairment rating, all of that still applies, right, for an internal, like a lung damage due to this chemical toxic exposure, right?
Yes, the injured worker still has to establish that the work caused something at work caused their injury or their lung issues or disease, whatever it is. So you have to establish that, and then you also have to establish that you have to get permanent disability benefits anyway. You have to establish that you have an impairment rating. And then establish what your restrictions are to determine whether you're totally disabled or what you're going to be ultimately entitled to in permanent disability benefits under Kentucky's workers' comp law.
Well, I would think if I were the manufacturer, if I were the employer, I'm going to go, well, no, you're a smoker. You've already got lung damage. We didn't do this. And then you, as the attorney representing the injured client, you've got to kind of wade through that as well, right? I mean, the doctors will look and try to make some type of call one way or the other.
Exactly. I mean, depending on what the lung condition is, if you've got someone who was exposed to a chemical that would cause the lung damage that they've got, the problem that they have, but cigarette smoking can also cause the exact same issue, and you've got somebody who, maybe they smoked a pack a day for 5 years, but they've been quit for 20 years, versus someone who smoked 3 packs a day for 20 years. Then establishing the causal relationship between the chemical and the disease is going to be much more difficult in the second situation than it is in the first.
Right.
So that's where all of these cases will be determined based on the specific facts of each individual case.
Okay. Yeah. So we've talked about when you've come into physical contact with the chemical. We've talked about an exposure that might be inhaled or cause that type of exposure. Let's talk briefly then about fatalities that may be linked to this chemical exposure. And again, under workers' comp, it handles a workplace fatality. There are some other I hate to say benefits, but really that's what it is. Do you want to kind of explain how that's handled?
Sure. If you die as a result of a workplace exposure, occupational disease, chemical exposure, frankly, it doesn't matter if it's an injury or occupational disease, how it's treated under the Workers' Compensation Act, then your certain survivors of yours are entitled to receive benefits as a result of that death. A surviving spouse would receive 50% of the benefits subject to some limitations depending on if there are minor children involved. That can adjust it a little bit. Then minor children receive benefits as well, and they would receive the benefits up to age 18 or till age 22 if they're enrolled in an accredited educational facility, or an adult child who is actually dependent on the worker can receive benefits. In others who are actually dependent on the worker could receive benefits under the
So you could have an
workers'
adult
compensation.
parent, for instance.
Exactly. If you have a parent that is dependent on you to support them, then they can receive benefits under the Workers' Compensation Act. And if the death occurs within 4 years of the injury, and I think it's the same with disease, within 4 years of contracting the disease, then the estate would receive a lump sum payment as well, which is 2022's $95,000 and some change. That would be paid to the estate and then distributed according to the will, or if they don't have a will, according to Kentucky law.
And friends, if you're listening to this and you're interested, or you think that might be a situation, unfortunately, that you're involved in, Jeff and I did do a full podcast episode on workplace fatalities, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if you're on the website, jeffrobertslaw.com, and you go to the media button and go down to the podcasts, you'll see a whole bunch of content below just where you click to play this episode. Those are called show notes, and in those show notes I will have various links to different pages and different resources for you, but I will put a link to that specific workplace fatality podcast. So if you want more information, that we'll make that available to everybody. Jeff, let me transition now so that I'm not necessarily talking about the employee himself or herself. Now we're talking about people in and around the neighborhood or in a different business that may be injured now due to something that happened at the plant in the area. Typically, you could look at, the same stuff, I guess. You could have a chemical cloud, which could come back to toxic exposure, so you have respiratory issues. Unfortunately, you could also have explosions, and maybe something happens to a tank at the plant, and then suddenly several areas around the plant might be impacted as well.
Correct. Yes, that can occur from that standpoint, unfortunately. And we kind of touched on this earlier, but if the chemical goes outside the bounds of the property of the plant and injures someone else, then they have a potential claim against the plant that released that chemical, whether they're working at a different plant and they get injured, or if they are, if they live in, their home is in close proximity and they get exposed that way, then they would have a claim against the plant that allowed that chemical to be released that caused the injury to that person.
And these will now be handled in civil court. These will be outside of workers' comp. This is a regular personal injury type situation, right?
A regular personal injury type of claim that would go, instead of going through the workers' comp administrative process, this would go to circuit court and go through the normal process of a personal injury claim. So, and in that situation, you have to, in a work comp situation, you have to establish something at work is what caused the injury, but you don't have to establish that that your employer was negligent. In these other cases where you're going into civil court to personal injury, you do have to establish negligence on the part of the plant in that situation. Now, as a general rule, if a chemical on that plant is allowed to get off of the property of that plant,
one would think there's negligence.
You most likely negligence occurred in some form or fashion. And if it's negligence of an employee of the plant is responsible for its employees, so they are liable.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, so they are liable for the mistakes that their employees make from that standpoint. So, you have to establish the negligence. You still have to establish that chemical is what caused the problems that the person has. And the with that type of claim, the person can recover pain and suffering, or if it's a fatality, then unfortunately, then the spouse and any minor children can pursue a loss of consortium, claim loss of love and affection over their loss of that individual as well. So it opens up a different variety of claim than what an employee themselves would have.
Right, and that's interesting, but that is that grand bargain that we've talked about when workers' comp law was established, especially in Kentucky or adopted into Kentucky. You kind of give up the right to pursue pain and suffering, but you do get other benefits as part of the workers' compensation law.
Exactly, and some would call it a grand bargain, some might call it a bad bargain.
Right.
But yes, that was a trade-off made when the workers' compensation system was developed, is that the injured workers do not have to establish negligence against the employer to be able to receive workers' compensation benefits, so that workers' comp benefits are available to a much wider variety of people, or wider injuries, I should say, in wider events. And the reason for that is because you had people who were getting injured that wasn't a result of negligence, but then they had no income benefits coming in. Nobody was paying their medical bills back in the early 1900s. And so they developed this process. But what they did is it said, if we're going to open this up to a wider variety of people, then we're going to reduce what each individual person can receive as a result of this. So as a result of a workplace injury. So they've basically expanded the number of people who are covered, but reduced the amount that any individual person could receive as a result of that.
Well, and some people may think that's unfair because the neighborhood, has more available to them, but it's a different scenario. And it is, I personally think it is better that, hey, look, I can get paid, I can get some benefits coming in quicker, and there are some definite benefits to having that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. There are advantages to having the workers' compensation system in place. There's been some states, including Kentucky, have reduced the benefits to an injured worker over time, as far as how they calculate permanent disability and things of that nature. But it's still, as a general rule, better for people to be covered under workers' compensation, employees to be covered under workers' compensation. And if the employee doesn't want to be covered, they do have the option of waiving the Workers' Compensation Act, and then they would have their civil remedies. Then if they lift a heavy box and they blow out their back, unless they got short-term disability and health insurance, they're going to be out. They're not going to be receiving anything while they're off work. And
no system's perfect, and
correct.
You just hope to adequately provide for all these situations. And it's a little odd at times, but there is a rationale and there's a history behind it.
Yes, and there is reason behind it, and it's hard to explain to some clients at times that if one person is injured, that's an employee, and standing right beside them is somebody who works for a different employer who's a vendor on there and has the exact same type of injury, and one's got a civil lawsuit where they can recover pain and suffering, the employee doesn't. Explain to that employee why this other person has a completely different claim, and a claim that's going to be ultimately more valuable in all likelihood if there is negligence. It can be difficult at times.
I would think so.
Yeah.
Jeff, we've got a few minutes left here in this episode, and I just wanted to ask, in cases like this, I mean, we talked about personal injury and those civil type claims. In your practice, you handle workers' compensation claims, but you also handle personal injury claims. And in some of these situations, there might also be a Social Security disability claim as well, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and again, you handle those as well.
I do.
Okay. Yeah. And so okay, I think I've got an exposure issue. I think I've been injured in a chemical-related accident. There are a number of different ways to get a hold of you. The good news is you've got two different offices now.
Correct.
So a lot of times if they want to come to visit you face-to-face, they'd make an appointment and then come down to your Murray office, which is your primary office. But you've recently opened up the office in Hopkinsville.
Yes, I've got a office in Hopkinsville now where I can meet with clients. So if Murray office is more convenient for the client, they can come in and meet with me at the Murray office. If the Hopkinsville office is more convenient for the client, we'll set the appointment up at the Hopkinsville location, and then they can, we will talk with them there, whichever is more convenient for the client. And if you are unfortunately have been injured as a result of a chemical exposure or something of that nature, you can call me up and we can talk about that. The phone number for scheduling an appointment at the Murray or the Hopkinsville office is the same. It's 270-753-0053, or you can call the 800 number, 1-800-844-5108, and we can schedule you an appointment at either one of those locations. If you're away from there, I handle cases, workers' comp cases all over the state. In other cases, personal injury cases all over the state. So if you live further away and you would prefer to meet do a phone meeting or to do a Zoom video conference, we can schedule those up as well and meet that way. And the initial consultation with me is always free in these situations. So the first meeting, there's no pay. You don't have to pay to come in to see me, and then I work on a contingency fee basis, which means that I get paid at the end of the case when I am successful in the case. So you're not out of pocket any money until the end of the claim when I'm putting money in my client's pocket. Right.
In a contingency fee situation, obviously sometimes there may be other court costs and other expenses related to pursuing that claim. The client is normally responsible for those, I believe, in the way we do that. But again, in a contingency fee, you're not paid until the end. It's not an hourly fee like maybe a family law attorney or some other type of attorney. This is really, if Jeff's got to win to earn money on this. So I mean, it makes it much easier for someone who's been injured to actually get in and get qualified representation in this legal situation.
Correct. That's the benefit of the contingency fee. And some attorneys do charge the expenses regardless of the recovery. I don't. In my practice, the expenses are also contingent upon recovery. So if we're successful, I'll get paid the attorney fee and reimburse my expenses. But if we're not successful, then the client doesn't pay me anything in that situation. I end up eating the loss over the expenses, because in my view on that is, the client's pursuing the claim because I've told them that I think it's a viable claim to pursue. And from that standpoint, and if I'm wrong in that regard, I should be the one to pay as a result of that, not the client. And that's just the way I do it. And I know some attorneys don't do it that way. That's just the way I think is the more appropriate way to, I like to treat people the way I'd want to be treated. So.
Well, that's why you're apt to say small town service, big city results. I kind of like hearing that.
That's exactly right. That's I like that motto, and I think it's accurate, and I've had others tell me that it's accurate as well, so that's good.
Outstanding. Jeff, I want to thank you for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this information helpful and insightful. If you have questions, feel free to give Jeff and his team a call there. And again, I'll put that phone number down in the show notes. But you can also ask him questions and talk about your case through the website. So if you go to jeffrobertslaw.com, there's a contact us form, and you can send him an email right through there again. So we'll be back in about 2 weeks. Once again, Jeff, thanks for your time. Always good to see you.
Good to see you, Jim, and thank you to the listeners.
Absolutely. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Jeff will return in 2 weeks. Until then, he invites you to visit jeffrobertslaw.com and follow his firm on Facebook. At the Roberts Law Office, you'll find a history of small town service and big city results.